Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, pronouns he, him, and I run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Tanya Selva, excuse me, Tanya Selvaratnam's memoir, Assume Nothing, A Story of Intimate Violence, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after 94 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We would like to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, authors like Tanya, we wouldn't be here today, and we are so appreciative of it. So, tonight we are thrilled to have with us Tanya Selvaratnam for the launch of Tanya's book, Assume Nothing. Tanya is the author of The Big Lie, Motherhood, Feminism, and the Reality of the Biological Clock. Her work has been published in the New York Times, Vogue, CNN, Glamour, and McSweeney's. She is an Emmy-nominated and Webby-winning filmmaker who has produced for Aubin Pictures, Glamour Women of the Year, Planned Parenthood, and the Vision and Justice Project. Joining Tanya in conversation is Cindy Levy. Cindy is a journalist, media leader, and advocate for women. A cultural critic who appears frequently on TV and live events, she is the former editor-in-chief of both Glamour and Self magazines. The force behind barrier-breaking initiatives like Glamour Women of the Year, the country's preeminent event showcasing women, and the Girl Project, supporting girls' education, and the author or producer of numerous books, including the 2018 New York Times bestseller, Together We Rise, about the making of the Women's March. Cindy has interviewed heads of state, Hollywood, and fashion's biggest personalities and iconic leaders from all walks of life. Her many awards and honors include recognition from the White House, the United Nations, and various media organizations. She is currently a senior fellow at the University of Southern California's Annenberg Center. Finally, our thanks to our event co-presenter, the Meteor, a feminist creative collective, which launched this year. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Tanya and Cindy to the stage.
Thank you, Sabir. And hi, Tanya.
Book tour event.
There you are. You were muted for a second. I know, we're so excited. I don't know if everybody who's watching knows that this is day one of your book's life, and I have a visual prop here, Assume Nothing. It came out just today, correct?
It actually launches at midnight, but yeah. So
all right. So we're early, and so how are you feeling on day one of this big and important book?
I am feeling overwhelmed by the support, feeling a lot of love and gratitude for all the people who helped me along the journey of the book and prior to that, and also really looking forward to when I can take a break.
Well, that's not happening for at least another hour. And this is such a beautiful book, and I know there are so many questions that I want to ask. And of course, for everybody who's listening, please, ask questions in the chat, and we'll be taking those a little later in the conversation. But I want to start. There's a line that you first shared with me, and for background, Tanya and I have known each other for several years, and you told me this really wonderful line that I know you thought about a lot as you wrote this very personal book. And it's a line from the poet Muriel Rukeyser, and she wrote, "What would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open." So this book tells a very powerful truth, your own true story of a relationship that you were in with Eric Schneiderman, then the Attorney General of New York State, a relationship that became abusive, emotionally and physically abusive, and your journey through that, and your decision to leave, and then ultimately to be public about what you had experienced. what made you decide, having lived through this really traumatic experience, that it was something you wanted to share publicly?
Well, I wrote my way out of the darkness through this book. It was part of my own healing and recovery. And I wrote the book because I wanted to help others spot, stop, and prevent intimate partner violence in their own lives. And also to be a call to action to chip away at the cycle of violence that we are conditioned to normalize from the time that we are born. I heard from so many people, strangers and friends I've known for decades, who shared with me their own stories of abuse after I shared mine. And I wanted to take the stigma and shame out of being a victim and survivor and hopefully help others find their light and heal.
That's beautiful. The book is really beautifully written, and some of the most sort of powerful and moving parts, and parts that were new to me, even though you and I have known each other for years, are about your childhood and about the kind of home you grew up in, and the violence that you experienced. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that to kind of set the stage for those who are watching.
Well, part of the writing of the book was excavating the fractures within myself that needed to heal, that came from being a child who witnessed horrific domestic violence. You know, I was a child who would stand up to my father when he was violent. I would stand between him and my mother to stop the beating. And then finding myself as an adult in an abusive relationship, I wanted to explore that trajectory. So the scenes involving my family are painful. They were very hard to write, but I feel like they're crucial to people understanding like how we have these ancient fractures. As A.M. Holmes said in her beautiful blurb for my book, the ancient fractures that we all possess. But some of my favorite scenes involving my family are with my grandmother, who's turning 97 in April, and who I'm very close with. And there's a scene with my grandmother where it's after Eric and I have parted ways, and she says to me, I was happy for you, but then you found you had a frog. And that scene makes me smile. Like, it's made me smile when I was writing it. It made me smile when I look back at it because, you know, grandma tells it like it is. She doesn't hold back.
Going back to your childhood and when you were growing up, when you were much younger, there are so many scenes that are really indelible, but there's a great moment where you write about a stuffed animal and how you were kind of clinging to it in the middle of this very sort of chaotic and disturbing environment.
Well, the scientists understand, and not enough people understand, how trauma sinks in at a cellular level and imprints on our brain these memories that are hard to shake. And one of my most vivid memories from childhood is when I was watching my father beat my mother, and I was crying at the top of my lungs. And in my hand, I was holding a white stuffed bunny. And I remember how scared I was in that moment, but also how much I loved that stuffed bunny in my hand. And so there's just the juxtaposition of those memories.
You write really beautifully also about your scar, and I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what it is, what it had meant to you prior to your being in this relationship, and then what it came to mean through that experience.
Well, for those who aren't aware, I have scars running down the length of my torso from surgery for 2 cancerous tumors. And my scars had been a source of insecurity for me. And when I met Eric Schneiderman, he would at first refer to my scars like they were a badge of courage, like I had overcome adversity. And then as the darkness started to seep in and he became abusive, my scars were ugly and he wanted me to get plastic surgery to remove them. And it was important for me to write about them because abuse comes in many forms. It's not only physical violence, it's also verbal abuse, digital abuse, legal abuse, financial abuse, that coercive control and manipulation that I was not prepared for. And he customized the abuse for his victims, which I would find later through the reporting of the New Yorker. And with me, it was criticism of my scars. And that was, and scars for me are a marker of time before and after. And I liken them to moments of abuse, whether the abuse happens for a few minutes or a few years. It is a marker of time before and after, and no one should have those memories.
So, you've just alluded to this time where you're, becoming entwined in a relationship that is turning dark, as you say. One of the things that you've said is that, quote, I wasn't prepared for my path to intersect with an abuser. And I'm wondering if you can tell us more about what that means for you and why you in particular say that, since of course none of us can see someone else's abuse coming, but in what way were you personally not prepared?
Well, I wasn't prepared for my path to intersect with an abuser, and I wasn't prepared for the grooming, gaslighting, and manipulation that I went through, and the stages I went through to get entangled in an abusive relationship. And that is how I structure the first half of the book, so that I can walk the reader through those stages of abuse and help them understand and if they identify, to call it out in their own lives. But I had never been in an abusive relationship before. I have spent my whole career advocating for the rights and safety of women and children. I look back and I can't believe that I myself got caught up in that relationship, but even fierce women get abused. And when you look at the statistics that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men will experience some form of intimate partner violence in their lifetimes, and millions of those experience the abuse before they turn 18, there's an intimate partner violence crisis that we need to urgently address.
And something that you just said, makes me also want to hear you talk a little bit about the title, Assume Nothing. What is it that people assume that we shouldn't assume?
A victim looks like all of us, regardless of background, and perpetrators are of all stripes. In my situation, Eric Schneiderman was worshipped as a progressive hero and an ally of the Me Too movement, a champion for women publicly, but privately he abused me. So Assume Nothing is, it's a reframing of what he used to say to me, which was assume nothing. And he would also say, trust no one. But it's also a way of me taking control of that narrative and shaping it to be a tool that helps others. I feel like he messed with the wrong woman on many levels. I wish I didn't have memories of being a victim. I wish I didn't have to come forward. I wish I didn't have to write this book. But because I'm a storyteller and because I'm a documentary filmmaker, it's like, this is my way of turning my negative experience into something that I hope helps others heal.
You're talking about that decision to come forward. And of course, for those who haven't read it yet, although I can't read the book, it's the short version there. But for those who haven't read it yet, before Tanya decided to come forward and write this book, she had already told her story publicly to reporters at the New Yorker. And this was in the months after the advent of the quote unquote modern Me Too
Okay, are we back? And can you hear me, Tanya?
Yeah, completely.
Okay, apologies to everybody. I will talk that much faster for the rest of the interview. But what we were just saying is that, for those who don't know the story, before Tanya wrote the book, she had made, after coming out of this very dark relationship and leaving the relationship, she had made the decision to talk to reporters at the New Yorker. And I wonder, I mean, that was a difficult decision because this was, your ex-partner was a very well-placed political man, as you just described. He was also a darling of the progressive movement and somebody who a lot of Democrats were looking to as a sort of savior during the first year or two of the Trump presidency. And so, I'd love to hear about how you made that decision to come forward and tell your story publicly.
Well, the decision was made for me when I was made aware that he had, in fact, abused women before me. When the abuse first started happening to me, because it came out of nowhere and was so jarring and surprising, I thought the abuse was specific to me and that I had done something to cause it. Also, he was increasingly in the national spotlight. His drinking was increasing. His behavior was becoming more erratic. He knew that he had problems, and he said he was going to try and get help. So I held on to that hope that he would get help. But then when it became clear that the cycle of violence I was wrapped up in was not going to end, and a friend connected me with a domestic violence expert who helped me extricate myself, she said, "You can't be the first one he's done this to. This behavior does not arise out of nowhere." And then about a month later, an investigative reporter friend of mine identified a previous girlfriend who had been many, many years before me, who had an eerily similar story. And that's when I knew, if there's her and me, there must be others. And also the Me Too movement had recently taken off. And I felt that the story coming out was inevitable. And I had a very clear aim, even though I was terrified, which was to prevent him from harming other women and also to open up a conversation about intimate violence.
You described that moment when you're talking to your friend about it. And I remember, you and I were colleagues at around that time. And, I'm sure, like, all of our other colleagues, didn't know the trauma that you were going through, and saw instead you coming into work every day and working incredibly capably and professionally, and sometimes on material that, must have been triggering and difficult given the circumstances. And I wonder, I know, and I said to you before that, I don't have any confidence that I necessarily handled the conversations that you and I had once we started to talk about it the right way. And I wonder if you can talk about conversations you had with friends and with allies that were positive and constructive for you, because I'm sure a lot of people watching, know somebody, given the statistics, we all must know somebody or many somebodies who are in dangerous situations. And I think having, a window into how one handles that in a helpful way could be really useful for folks to hear.
Well, understanding that a friend or loved one in an abusive relationship might not be able to talk about it. My advice to the person who is that friend is to be patient, be a good listener, not be judgmental, and ask questions that might elicit answers, because you never know when the person in the abusive relationship might want to open up. You can't force that opening up. And in my situation, it's beautiful how it happened, even though it was at a very painful time in my life, which is that a friend of mine knew that I was going through a hard time. She reached out to me, asked if I wanted to talk. And I had told her about Eric's controlling behavior, about the way I dressed, what I ate, and his drinking. And then she asked me, "Does he hit you?" And those 4 words changed everything in my trajectory, because she's like my sister. I wasn't going to lie. And I said yes. And she then said, "I want you to speak to a friend of mine." And that friend was a domestic violence expert. And I spoke with that person a few days later. And so I hope that by sharing this in the book, as well as the resources for organizations of how to get help, that other people do the same, that they be that friend, that sister that my friend was to me.
That's a really beautiful story. You were talking before about how you went through that initial phase of feeling like the abuse was specific to you, and that you personally had done something to cause it. And, that idea of blame and shame that surrounds survivors has been in the news a lot over the last week. I know you and I have talked about the interview that FKA Twigs just did. And for those who might have missed it, the artist FKA Twigs went public about a month, 6 weeks ago with charges of physical abuse against her ex-partner, the actor Shia LaBeouf. And she was interviewed several days ago by Gayle King and she was asked, well, why didn't you leave? And she said, I want to reframe that because that's the wrong question. And the question is instead, why did he continue to hold you hostage? So that idea of, instead of asking, why doesn't she leave, which is, such a common question asked, that instead it should be, why does the abuser continue to abuse? And, I'm curious what your reaction was to that interview. And then sort of more broadly, we've been talking about these issues around abuse for so long. How do we actually change this mentality that still prompts women to, hold themselves accountable for something that is 100% not their fault?
Well, I know that Gayle King got criticized a lot for asking that question, and it's seen as an inappropriate question to ask of survivors. And every survivor is unique and has their own way of recovering and healing and processing. In my situation, I wanted to answer that question, why didn't I leave? Because it helped me understand how I got into the relationship in the first place. And this goes back to my wanting to excavate the fractures within myself that needed to be healed. At the time that I met Eric Schneiderman, even though I was strong and independent on the outside, on the inside, I had come off a string of miscarriages, infertility, and divorce, and cancer that made me feel insecure about romance.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the perfect storm. I was ripe for the breaking.
Mm-hmm.
And also, as an empath, and because he was depressed and going through a hard time, I wanted to help him.
Mm-hmm.
So that helped me understand at least part of the answer to why didn't I leave. Also, another part is that he was seen as a savior, as doing important work. And did I really want to be that person that came forward against him? But the answer was so clear when I recognized that I was part of a pattern, that no, the abuse was not specific to me, and that he was going to do it to someone else. And there were the women who participated in the New Yorker story, both on the record and off the record or anonymously. And there were also the women who reached out to me after the New Yorker story came out to share their own stories of abuse by Eric Schneiderman. So I know I did the right thing. As like painful and uncomfortable as it was to be visible, I was very fortunate to have work I could throw myself into and a community of friends and colleagues that really provided this like coven of support around me.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wish that for everyone.
Mm-hmm. You know, you've referenced, and we were talking before about how, you know, how your ex-partner was a very politically powerful person. You know, you write in the book about the kind of system of enablers that a lot of abusers have around them, and in his case, a lot of those enablers were women. And can you talk a little bit about that and what it was like confronting that kind of system?
Well, part of what lured me in and made me feel that Eric Schneiderman was in fact somebody that I could be in a relationship with is that he was surrounded by feminists, by meditators, by progressive leaders who really gave him cover. And in some cases, they knew about his past. And I don't even try to wrap my head around the enablers. Sadly, many of those enablers are women. Their power is entwined with that of the abuser. The abuser is their conduit to power. And in pretty much all the cases, and I feel it's hard for me to say this, but they were powerful white women. And I do think that there is such a thing as white female patriarchy. And I feel that there's a war between feminists and patriarchs, and those on the side of feminists are not only women, and those on the side of patriarchs are not only men. And there were the women who tried to discredit me soon after the New Yorker story came out. And I had reporter friends who told me their names, and I kind of noted it and put it away. And I'm not going to say their names now because I don't want them coming after me. I just focused on doing the right thing. But I will say that the cults of personality that form around rich people, talented people, powerful people who are abusers are damaging to those who are in those cults and damaging to society. And we need to unpack them and unravel them and make accountability more important, and also make peace and kindness more exciting than violence. And there's so much wrapped into that ecosystem, from our, you know, at the governmental level, at the media level. Everyone needs to take more responsibility.
Exciting peace. That's a great phrase. And just picking up on what you were just saying, the thread of race also, you know, you pull it very powerfully through the book. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how racism intersected with abuse in your experience.
Well, in addition to the vulnerability around my scars, Eric Schneiderman customized the abuse for me. I was the only non-white woman in the story. And he would criticize my hair as being wild. Right now it's wintertime, it's gotten flat, but as it gets more humid and summertime and I'm out, it gets bigger, and I love it. I love it when my hair gets humid. But he wanted me to always have my hair straightened or tied up. And the other thing that happened is the verbal abuse in the sexual context, with him using master-slave terminology, was flat out racist. And it was not something that the two previous girlfriends that had reached out to me and wanted to meet with me mentioned. They had experienced abuse that was customized in different ways, such as being told to get Botox. In my case, it was get plastic surgery for your scars, get a boob job, tie your hair up, and he wanted to call me he wanted me to call him master, and I was his slave, and I was his brown girl. And it was disturbing. It's embarrassing to talk about now, but I also feel like those micro details are important because they are not unique to my experience. The racism that is inflicted on women in intimate partner violence, on Black and brown women, is something that needs to be addressed. And also the way that the domestic violence crisis disproportionately impacts Black and brown women needs to be addressed. And the statistics are well known that the majority of women in prison have experienced some form of sexual violence. The majority of homeless women. I mean, it is so fraught on so many levels. And you know, when we say believe women, believe Black and brown women.
You were just alluding to, you know, the idea of shedding light on intimate partner violence as a distinct thing. And I know you believe that we're heading into sort of the next era of Me Too. What does that look like to you? How is that era different?
Well, I've been feeling this wave. So when the Me Too movement first began after the Harvey Weinstein story broke in October 2017, I felt waves crash around me because my relationship had been unraveling in real time when that movement started. But the conversation was not so much about intimate violence in committed relationships. And that is where I feel this next wave is coming. I feel that we are at the cusp. I feel those waves crashing around me again with the stories by Evan Rachel Wood and FKA Twigs that I have been so grateful for, but also really saddened by. And what I am aware of in their stories is that they experienced abuse at very different life stages than I did. And we are separated by generations, but we're united by trauma. And I hope that by sharing my story and by their sharing their stories, that we take the veil off of this insidious form of violence, which happens behind closed doors in the privacy of people's home, where there's typically only two witnesses, the abuser and the victim. And it's a he said, she said situation. There's so much shame around it. It's so difficult to talk about. But in my story, I was fortunate that it started as he said, she said, but then it became he said, she said, she said, she said, she said. You had multiple women interviewed independently of each other, very different from each other, who had eerily similar stories. So clarity emerged. And I feel that the dam needs to break because domestic violence crisis, especially during the pandemic, has reached an emergency.
I think your book is part of breaking that dam. And I have so many more questions I want to ask you about this issue. And I know we have also a number of questions from the audience, but I want to just toggle to a slightly different subject, which is how you actually approach the project of writing this book, because, you know, it's incredibly difficult to write any book. It's really hard to write a compelling, honest memoir. And it's even harder to write one that is about, you know, your own trauma. And so I'm curious just about how the process of your writing was. Was it, you know, a few hours at the top of a day and then you'd go on to something else? Was it just back-to-back writing for months? And how did you approach it in a way that also prioritized, you know, your own need to take care of yourself?
Well, this is where my background as an academic and also as a documentary filmmaker really helped with the process of writing this book.
I bet.
In addition to being a storyteller. And I am an intrepid note taker. I have been since I was a child. I think because I was shy and an introvert, I used to write things out for myself to help me understand what I was observing. I would write, you know, things that inspired me. And when I sat down to write the book, the first thing I did was I printed out all the notes I had been taking in real time and all the documentation I had. And I had about 300 pages worth. And I spread them out on a table and I read through them. Reading through the notes were painful, emotional. I cried a lot. I listened to all the sad songs. But what I did is I would take the snippets of notes, I would mark them. I already had the structure for the book in my head because I knew that I wanted to structure it around the stages that one goes through to get into an abusive relationship. And then about halfway through the book, the script gets flipped when I have more agency over my body, my life, and my story. So I had the structure for the book. And I also knew that I wanted to draw people in with the narrative and then leave them with resources to help themselves and their loved ones. So I would mark the bits of the notes based on the structure I had already lined out. And then I would take the bits and do string outs like we do in documentary film. I would do a string out for each chapter in a separate file. I'm getting very nerdy and technical here, but
Interesting.
And then I would flesh out the string out, adding texture, adding layers, adding scenery, color, vibrancy. And also because I had been taking lots of photos and documentation, those would spark memories. Like I had the incredible fortune to have Jennifer Gonnerman, who you and I both know, an investigative reporter who had come with me to get my things from Eric Schneiderman's house after we had parted ways. And Jennifer said to me before we left, take pictures of the rooms in the apartment. You might need to refer to them to spark memories of what happened in those rooms. So I looked at those photos and they were incredible touch points for me. So that's how I approached the writing of the book. And I wanted to let myself go through the experience that had happened in real time when I was writing the book so that the book feels very immediate and present. But it was also very important for me that even though the subject was difficult, that it ends with light. And so I came out of the process of writing the book stronger than before and also feeling liberated. And I hope that the readers feel that too.
It does. The way you just described its arc, from this very harrowing sort of sense of danger to a place where you have more control and agency. You really feel that as you read it. I want to go to some of the questions that we have from folks who are watching, and I want to start with an important comment that Therese, I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name, Therese Murphy makes. She writes, can we please stress many times, if possible, the importance of having a safety plan by a professional advocate before leaving an abuser, and remind women that during and immediately after leaving are the most dangerous times. I will say there are a lot of resources, as Tanya was just saying, in the back of this book, and certainly, the National Domestic Violence Hotline and other resources are there to help women and others make safety plans as they prepare to leave when they are ready to do so. But Tanya, is there anything that you want to add on that point?
Yeah, Teresa, I'm so glad you asked that question, because that is one of my main objectives with the book, is to show the reader that there's no one size fits all approach for victims and survivors, that even though abuse is common, that every victim is unique. And I had a domestic violence expert who helped me with my own safety plan. I went through a security training with a team from Gavin DeBecker's office that really helped me prepare for my physical and personal safety. And it's incredibly important that women know that there are organizations out there that can help them. And this is where the friends or loved ones of people in abusive relationships can really be that lifeline, by connecting with those organizations and making sure that those organizations are appropriate for the victim. So not everyone might feel comfortable with a national organization. For instance, there are resources in the book about Strong Hearts Native Helpline, about the organizations that are specific to Black communities, the Latinx community, the LGBTQAI plus communities, young people. There are so many different types of victims and survivors, and making sure that there's a safety plan in place is important. I also think it's incredibly important that at a governmental level, there are more resources for those organizations that provide shelter, mental health counseling, and legal services to victims and survivors. And this is where we need the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, and also more support for restorative justice programs and community organizations.
I want to ask a question here posted by Salam. Salam writes, do you ever get over the abuse? I left a relationship a couple of years ago, which turned violent. I'm in therapy now, but I find I can't help but bring all of my trauma with me into new relationships. I'm now in therapy, but I guess what I'm asking is if there's a next phase where I don't flinch at a raised voice. Thank you for asking that question, Salam. Tanya?
Well, first, Salam, I'm very sorry about your experience. And although this is not a comfort, you are one of so many who have experienced abuse. And I can talk about the way I have approached my recovery, which is working with a domestic violence expert, Jennifer Friedman, a trauma therapist, and also the support of friends and family and colleagues. It is ongoing. I also meditate a lot. Getting ready for this book release, I've gone from meditating once or twice to meditating 3 or 4 times. The trauma that sets in at a cellular level is very hard to unseat. It takes a lot of work. It's hard work, but it's work that must be done. And I think the mental health impacts of abuse are ones that need to be addressed as importantly as accountability and repercussions for abusers. We need a victim-centered approach to dealing with abuse.
This is a question from Clara. She writes, you said you had a friend who asked the right question and then offered a friend who was a domestic violence advocate for you to speak to. If I have a friend who I believe is in an abusive relationship, if my friend ever decides to open up to me, how do I find resources to give her, to offer her similar expert advice?
Well, first, it is wonderful that you asked that question and are willing to help other friends. I would say start by just asking simple questions that are not leading, like, how are you doing? Is everything okay? And seeing where that leads, be in the moment. And then if it turns out that you have a friend or loved one who is in an abusive relationship, there are tons of resources in my book. It was very important for me to have kind of like a cheat sheet of how to spot intimate partner violence, the different forms of intimate partner violence, and also the effects of abuse, the physiological impact, the emotional impact, the mental impact. And the organizations are the resources to contact, and they can help you help your friend.
And interestingly, Tanya and I worked together on a project about domestic violence almost a year ago. And I remember several people at several different hotlines saying that a lot of the calls they receive are not actually just from survivors or people who are experiencing abuse. It's also from family members and friends and coworkers of people who are experiencing abuse. So they're absolutely equipped to answer your call as well as your friends.
Yes, and Cindy, that's a good plug actually, because that the project that we worked on, Night of Solidarity for the Meteor, which is co-hosting this event, is available to watch on YouTube. Please look it up. It provides a ton of resources there as well, and also you hear from victims, survivors, and allies in that virtual event that we produced.
Yeah, a real range. And that gets also to the next question that we have here from Mahfouz, who writes, does intimate violence in same-sex relationships differ in any way than in heterosexual relationships? And would your advice on resources be different for queer couples? And I know you referenced that there's a wide range of resources here in the book, but anything to add there?
Well, the story is told through the lens of my experience, which was in a heterosexual relationship, but domestic violence, it cuts across all communities. And I can't answer if it's different. Every violent relationship is unique, but there are definitely patterns to look for: the coercive control, the emotional abuse, the physical violence, and the long-lasting trauma is shared by so many victims, and violence between same-sex couples, and also the violence inflicted on trans people. The statistics are devastating. And I have resources for those communities as well in the book.
Yes, I'm looking them up, but it might take me.
Trans Lifeline.
Trans Lifeline, yes, and I know there are a tremendous number of other organizations. So I will I'll get that and I'll post it. I'll post it on the Facebook page under this conversation. This is an interesting question, and you've been very clear about the fact that there are so many different forms of abuse, and in your situation, it took the form of control, verbal abuse, as well as physical abuse. In other relationships, there's financial control and financial violence. This is a question from Ellen, who asks, isn't the depth of abuse leading up to the physical abuse just as devastating as the hitting? I'm not diminishing either the verbal or the physical. It seems as if the physical is the only key for legal recourse and protection. Is there any legal recourse for emotional abuse, for instance, being isolated, etc.?
That is an incredible question, and definitely. I write in the book about how almost as stinging as the slaps and the spitting and the choking were the verbal attacks on my scars, on my breasts, on my hair, on my skin. And that is the way that I got broken down. And coupled with physical violence, you really feel like you're in hell. And I do feel that there need to be repercussions, legal repercussions for coercive control. And there need to be repercussions for inflicting abuse in all forms. And the laws need to change.
Mm-hmm. I do know that with regard to financial abuse, which I know we haven't talked about here, but is a factor in so many people's cases, that there are now an increasing number of laws and attempts to pass new laws that will allow survivors to be able to, either recoup some lost earnings if their abuser has been taking them, or additionally to get their credit records cleared, because that's a problem. This is a question from Sarah. She writes, and I share this question in the context of what we're talking about, wanting to be mindful not to ask the kinds of questions that survivors have protested against in the past. But Sarah asks, is there anything someone could have said to get you to leave your abuser sooner?
There were many friends who, after my story became public or in the lead up to my coming forward, said they wished they could have read between the lines, because they could tell that I was subdued in the relationship. They could tell that I was not myself. I would say things like, he's depressed. There's so much pressure on him. I'm trying to help him. I would talk about his drinking too much. But, they can't blame themselves for not reading between the lines if I was not opening up. But I would say, if you feel like your friend is not herself or himself or themselves, then just ask questions. If you sense something is wrong, so many of my friends sensed something was wrong. But it took that one friend asking, does he hit you, for me to open up.
Before we wrap up, I want to make sure that this is an interesting question. Sorry, I need to interrupt my own question to ask you this from Nancy, who asks, once the book tour is over, will you ever read your book again?
Oh gosh, I am right now minute by minute, day by day. I can't project, but you know what? I'm going to have to, because the book is being turned into a series.
Woo! Yes, we haven't talked about that. That's incredible. A TV series, right?
Yes, a TV series. It has been optioned by ABC Signature Disney Television, with Joanna Coles executive producing.
Mhm.
We'll make some very exciting announcements about it soon. The development is underway. And I had no intention of writing a book, but I was inspired by people sharing their stories with me.
Mhm.
And I had no intention of the book being turned into a series, but I was very fortunate that Joanna read the manuscript and um, felt that this should reach a larger audience. And I'm excited about that because I want the message of the book to get out there. You know, when the New Yorker story first came out, I had made a conscious decision beforehand that I was going to hide. In fact, I left the country. I was not going to do any follow-up story. I was going to let the story speak for itself, that New Yorker story. But with this book, I know that it's important for me to be out there promoting it and its message, because I want people to buy it and pass it along. I
Mm.
want it to help others.
Mm. It's interesting because you've written, you know, and I think we heard about this in the intro. You've written a very personal book before. You wrote a book called The Big Lie, which was about your own infertility and thinking around motherhood. That was a very personal book that also had a similar, you know, ripple effect with women who read it. Does this one feel different? Like, how does the moment of completing such a personal story and kind of sending it out into the world, how has it differed between those two stories?
Well, I'll start with how they're similar. I mean, it's interesting for me as a writer and a documentary filmmaker and an academic that I've had these negative experiences that are very common to millions and millions of people,
Mm-hmm.
but that have so much stigma and shame around them. So when I wrote The Big Lie, what was similar is I had been taking notes about my experience. I had a series of 3 miscarriages, and then I attempted infertility treatment, during which it was discovered that I had 2 types of cancer. I did not know about the twists and turns that my life would take as I started writing the book, which was originally just to be about, you know, breaking the silence around miscarriages and infertility and giving people resources about what the experts wish they knew. And similarly, this book arose. But what is very different is that the details of this book are, hold on one sec. The details of this book are very, they're humiliating.
Mm.
They're embarrassing. They're details about my life that I would rather not have shared, except that I think it's important for me to share them so that other people can connect with them. It was
Mm-hmm.
very important for me to just, you know, put everything out there,
Mm-hmm.
because there are so many people who had similar experiences. I was shocked by how many women reached out to me saying that they had also experienced slapping, spitting, and choking
Mm.
during the sexual context without their consent.
Mm.
Now, pleasure is subjective, sexual pleasure, and I don't want to, it's not about prohibiting experimentation, but a key component of BDSM is consent. And I feel like part of the conditioning is that uh, abusers are watching the same porn that glorifies violence against women.
Mm.
And we really need more female and feminist directors making porn that celebrates mutual pleasure
Mm-hmm.
and consent.
Mm. Well, I know we don't have a huge amount more time, but I want to just ask you one more question, because this is a good note to wrap up on, from Deannis in the audience, who asks, in your opinion, what additional work can domestic violence agencies do to educate communities about the cycle of violence? And I guess I'll say also, let's maybe broaden that, talking about our stories and talking about your story as you have so powerfully in the book, Assume Nothing, is incredibly important. What else should we be doing as a culture to ensure that there are fewer stories like this out there to be told?
Well, we need to improve high school education, considering that millions of people experience intimate partner violence before they turn 18. And there needs to be healthy manhood trainings, like what A Call to Men does, the amazing organization. There need to be girl empowerment and self-defense training. And there need to be improved resources for organizations that service different communities with regard to domestic violence and violence prevention. And we also need more accountability of social media platforms, which have essentially become proliferation machines for violent and vitriolic behavior. And they can't act with impunity anymore. They hide behind the Communications Decency Act in Section 230. And this is something that the pioneering Carrie Goldberg has done a lot of work around, but that cannot continue. It has to change because they're given cover and act with impunity because they're like, we just provide the platform. We're not responsible for what people do with it and how they behave because of it. But no, that's wrong. That is absolutely flat out wrong. They do have a responsibility. It is like cognitive science 101. Repetitive messaging and how it settles in the brain. And I think of films like Wild Wild Country on Netflix, which shows how, it's about the Rajneeshis and how completely sane and rational people can be compelled by a narcissistic, megalomaniacal individual who positions himself as a guru to do completely crazy things. And we've seen that over the last, many years in America. How people that should get along have been made to feel like they should hate each other. And this goes back to my wish that peace and kindness become more exciting than violence. Violence is adrenaline inducing. It makes people feel something. And I want us to try and make people feel something with love. And this is where I think social media platforms, education, legislation, governmental resources, and public awareness campaigns. And the media takes a big responsibility for changing the narrative that we see. We need to see more stories that address this issue of violence, not just domestic violence, but the cycle of violence everywhere, in the school, in the workplace.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that the book does so powerfully also is that it doesn't just talk about the danger and the harm, although you walk the reader through those things in, language it's very harrowing, but you also show what happens afterward, which is not a neat, fairy tale ending, right? It's a difficult process, but you get into that in a way that I think is very rare and really powerful. So I will say in closing that the one thing we can all feel really good about using our social media for is promoting the book, Assume Nothing, #Assume Nothing. Tanya, congratulations. It's a beautiful and important book. And thank you for sharing it with us this evening. And thanks to all of you who have asked questions.
Well, thank you, Cindy. As you know, I couldn't have written the book without you. I couldn't have come forward without you. So that's why it was so meaningful for me to do this first conversation with you.
No, it was very, very meaningful for me too. I'm such an admirer of yours, and I'm just so happy that everybody else gets to hear this story in your own words. So thank you.
Before we close for the evening, I'd just like to say thank you to you both. Thank you, Tanya, for sharing your story with us tonight. Thank you, Cindy, for moderating. Also, a thanks to our event partners, the Meteor, which I've dropped another link in the chat for their website if you'd like to check out more of their programming. There's also a link in the chat to the project the Meteor and Tanya did together, the Night of Solidarity. The YouTube link is in the chat. And then if you're not sick of all of the links, as a final note, if you have yet to purchase Assume Nothing, you can click on the green purchase button center of your screen. And on that note, Thank you, everyone, for spending your evening with us, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you so much, Sabir. Thank you to the Strand.
Thank you. Thanks to the Strand.
Thank you to readers everywhere.